Okay. At this time, we'd like to get ready to transition to the first panel of the morning on archival collections and restorative justice. So if moderator Gina Nortonsmith will bring her panel members and have a seat, we will get started. So thank you so much for coming. We'd like to thank both of our deans, Dean Cohen, Dean Hackney, for participating with us this morning.
Good morning. My name is Gina Nortonsmith, and I am thrilled to be here today talking to you all. It's been an outstanding 2.5 years working on this project. But to these panelists who have graced us with their presence. Archives have rightly been criticized for colonial practices, assigning high value and worth to the records and papers of a dominant culture and powerful people, collecting those records and ignoring records of marginalized and under-resourced communities, and even when they do collect those materials and represent those communities, those materials are often hidden, difficult to access, and the description of those materials is often offensive and outdated. A further colonial practice has been, so for this first panel of the day, we are so fortunate to hear from panelists whose work pushes aside these colonial practices and approaches and use archival records as a means of recognition and restorative practices, using archival collections to raise awareness, educate, and make accessible those collections through digital means. To our panelists, I'm going to introduce them with very short versions of their bios, but you will see that in your program there's a QR code where you can read their full bios, and I encourage you to do so because you will begin to see why I am so excited that they are here to talk about their projects alongside our project. And so please do that. What I will do is introduce our first panelist, ask her to come up and speak, and then I will introduce the others as we are about to hear from them. When they are finished speaking, I have a few questions for them. They might have questions for each other. And then we will open the floor, and I will call on folks who may have questions for the panelists. Okay? Great. Our first panelist is Sion Wald-Michael. She is the founding director of the Center for Restorative History, and she is also a curator at the African American Social Science of African American Social Science History at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Two of her contributions in this digital arena and restorative arena are the Slavery and Freedom Show at the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Slave Rex Project. Again, just touching the surface of what her work and what she's done and why her presence here matters. So.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Gina, and good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to share the work of the Center for Restorative History at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, which is dedicated to creating museum and community-based historical practice grounded in the principles of restorative justice. And what I really want to do today is offer you a snapshot of what it looks like to tackle reparative work in collections and the archive at a national museum. So this center comes at a critical moment for the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, or what we call NMAH. We have a new director, a new strategic plan, along with a new mission that you see here, dedicated to creating a more just and compassionate future through the study of history. And at NMAH, we have this special opportunity, and of course with it, this profound responsibility to document and tell American history in the most inclusive and relevant and intersectional way possible. And we have a particular responsibility to those we have left out of our national story. We are in this tremendous period of growth and transition as a museum, and our challenge is to really make one of the units of the Smithsonian that has perpetuated the most harm actually pivot. Many of our museum's most cutting-edge projects are coming from a similar intellectual framework, and this center brings those focused on piloting a specific type of redress work with historically harmed communities together in conversation with one another and under one roof. And that, along with this desire to hone a redressive and community-engaged practice into a focused theory and method for folks in the museum field, is what led us to develop the Center for Restorative History. So what do we mean when we say restorative history? Restorative history is really grounded in restorative justice, which we all know is the process of seeking resolution to an injustice by redressing harm done to victims, holding offending parties accountable for their actions, and engaging the community in meaningful resolution of that conflict. Part of our unique contribution to this work as public historians is that we can do something that restorative justice practitioners readily admit that they struggle with, and that's have a serious examination of root causes. Using the principles of restorative justice, then, we collectively bring communities together to identify harms, needs, and obligations, but we also use the study of history to identify root causes. And in the case of a national museum, what this really does is it changes our narrative to be more accurate, to be more community-based, and reflective of local knowledges. And I'll mention all of the photos you'll see here are from our active collecting projects as well. Now, we've really defined restorative history as a theoretical approach to museum and archival work that uses the power of history as a tool to address harms of exclusion from in our national story in multiple ways. We've come up with this theory and method for doing redressive practice, understanding that one doesn't currently exist in our field. So this isn't just a novel term that we're proposing for the field of public history. It's a practical methodology that we've rigorously piloted with communities and ongoing consultation with domestic and international leaders in the field. Restorative history really does this by working with communities to expose silenced truths, to redefine our notion of belonging, and to change our institutions to be more civically responsible and move us towards a path of redress and healing. Pictured here, for instance, is the Emmett Till marker, which is placed in memoriam at Till's lynching site and is continually defaced and shot at to this very day. Each time the marker was shot, the community of Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, lobbied together and pieced funds to put up a new marker until they finally had to install a bulletproof sign. We've co-curated an exhibit with the community on this sensitive object that they say to them holds as much meaning as Till's very body. Beginning last fall, the marker was put on display in Flag Hall underneath the Starred Spangled Banner exhibit, which is a space that the museum has not showcased an object since 1998. This work has allowed us to not only bring in a sacred object that speaks as much to our nation's present as its past, but it's also allowed us to help do what the community wants most, and that was first to foreground Till's local Mississippi story, which is this little-known story of Black organizers in the 1970s fighting to put Black history on the political docket at a time where Till's memory was erased from Tallahatchie County, and this is both in the Black and white community. They did this because they knew that Black history's preservation was it was connected to their fundamental rights. So they put Black history on par with their fight for clean water, for fair housing, and their decades of organizing culminated in these markers dotting the landscape. And secondly, what the community wanted us to do was to bring resources to develop a local community center that serves the Black community there. And so how we arrive at this important work begins with asking those questions that center restorative practice. And pictured here is the final exhibition underneath the Star Spangled Banner exhibit. So again, a provocation, a confrontation, but also a moment of reflection for the national public. Our 8 pilots are organized under 4 areas that you see here: community engagement, collections, strategic partnerships inclusive of internships, and engaged scholarship. And as you can see from where we're working, many of our projects are multi-year and multi-site. In fact, we're already connected to over 100 partners and organizations around the country who are our partners in this work. And in terms of how we work, community engagement and co-creation is at our foundation, which really requires genuinely listening to and learning from partners to build that long-term foundation of trust and respect. This means changing standard museum practice, changing policy, and also changing corresponding budgets. And that's because this work takes a lot of time. We generally have a minimum commitment of 2 to 3 years with working with communities, which is mapped out into these 4 stages that you see on the right, which are focused on learning, collaborating, collecting, and mutual capacity building. Internally, too, we've also taken quite seriously enacting this theory and method and embracing the ethos of a startup, and have intentionally kept a lab-like feel as a space for prototyping new practice. So we're working on creating a center culture too, and that's meant thinking about less hierarchical work models, having consensus-based decision-making, and doing away really with museum hierarchy by experimenting with simultaneous research work across departments and across disciplines in a single setting. So I want to share a few examples of this work and how it changes the shape of collections and the archive. The Undocumented Project is a 3-year collecting initiative dedicated to chronicling undocumented organizing across 6 sites. Part of what is so exciting about this project is that there's only been a few signature moments in our nation's history when people who didn't have citizenship or voting rights were actually able to change government policy. It happened during emancipation, women's suffrage, civil rights, and it's happening again right now with undocumented young people. So to capture this historic moment, this project collects objects and oral histories, and it does so in close partnership with undocumented organizers shaping the scope. So again, leaving their unique mark on how organizing practices and techniques really shift from places like North Carolina to Mexico City. And pictured here is our oral historian who is collecting a narrative for our collection. I'm really proud to say that we have really pioneered at the Smithsonian having a change in policy to allow for redactions of oral histories and changing who has ownership up until the last point that oral history is deposited, which we can talk a bit more about in the Q&A. So at the foundation of this work is a commitment to community engagement and co-curation. I think that much is evident, but it's also about prototyping mutual capacity building practices, really centered on an equal valuing of community and museum expertise. So really seeing these communities as sites of knowledge production, not just sites of study. And in this way, the project is creating a real intellectual exchange. It's allowing these communities to really influence and change museum policy and practice, and also for our museum to build community capacity. So what does that look like? Real mutual capacity building is about resource exchange. As another example of a collecting initiative, we're in the early stages of our BLM collecting, which works closely with Movement for Black Lives activists around the country to capture their unique local concerns and approaches to that movement from 2012 onward. So together we will collect, we will co-curate, we'll build capacity, and we do that by asking organizers what it is that we can provide in our role as a public history institution to them over the next few years. And based on their needs, what folks are asking for is help with learning how to preserve their own histories. They're saying we don't always want to have to donate our objects to big institutions. So they're having us do things like donate oral histories for free, provide videography of personal accounts, and do focused trainings. So last summer, for instance, we put on a fully paid stipended workshop showing activists how to preserve their own objects, learn to create community archives, and how to do low-budget exhibitions and understand the principles of curatorial interpretation. The center also supports groundbreaking work and collections reassessments. Currently, due to the size and the age of our collection, the museum has no effective way to identify objects relating to African American history, for instance. And that has a huge impact on the stories that we can tell. Soon, the center will be launching this reclassification and inventory project of our political history holdings specific to African American history. And this project uses reparative strategies to make critical decisions about metadata and informatics. So really, which subject headings to keep or delete or change or collapse into other categories. We're really proud to say that this work has been identified by the Smithsonian as a prototype for increasing intellectual control over our collection of nearly 2 million objects, that's just our museum alone, and making findable otherwise unknowable, unsearchable specialty area collections. So the result of this work is better care, stronger stewardship, and increased public access to Black history. With regard to strategic partnerships, the center is also thinking about how we do restorative work for the future of the profession too. Beginning 2 years ago, NMAH, in collaboration with the Goucher Prison Education Partnership, or GPEP, began providing fully paid long-term internships, we're talking about 1 year to 2 year long internships, to formerly incarcerated GPEP alumni. This is a landmark program. It's the first of its kind at any museum or public history institution in the country, and we're piloting how to engage communities that have been neglected or even exploited, as is the case with this one, by museums, and including our own institution, and how we think more expansively about the diversity that we want to see in our field. A lot can be said about the outcomes for the center's work, but I think the most significant to highlight here is how it reshapes the national collection and the archive by really privileging firsthand accounts that otherwise would not have a voice in the collection in such a direct way. We believe that if our general history museums and archives don't shift practices in terms of how and what they reflect, then the broader historical paradigm doesn't either. And that's why approaching our work in a way that is integrative and intersectional is so urgent. And it really underscores that collections and archives can fundamentally reconceptualize our work across legal studies, arts, sciences, and humanities, and move it towards reparative action. Thank you.
So you see, even as much as we celebrate what we've done, we have a lot more to do. Our second speaker is Dr. Daniel Domingues de Silva, who is Associate Professor of History at Rice University and the author of The Atlantic Slave Trade from West Central Africa, 1780 to 1867. He is also the host for the Slave Voyages, slavevoyages.org resource, the world's largest database of voyages of enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic and between ports within the Americas. If you are not familiar with this resource, you must look at it. You must. And again, many other things. Read his full bio. But I want you to hear from him, so I'm going to ask him to come up and talk to us.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you, Jordana, Lauren, for the lovely invitation. It's great to be here at this auspicious moment. Congratulations to everyone involved in organizing the Burnham and Nobles Archives. It's a major milestone and endeavor. So I am already about 21 years involved with this project. I started when I was in college. And slavevoyages.org, what is it? It is a pioneer in the digital humanities, the largest database of slave voyages in the world, connecting places in Africa and Americas and between points within the Americas, as Gina previously mentioned. We are now trying to expand to also cover the Indian Ocean, parts of Asia. We just had a workshop about it. The website is freely available to the public at slavevoyages.org. The website was originally created at Emory University, the Center for Digital Scholarship, but it has since migrated to Rice University where I work, and it is powered by Oracle for Research, a cloud service provider. And it is currently sustained by a consortium of institutions. I will talk a little bit more about them in just a second. The images that you see there are of different pages within the website. The website is used by a lot of people. As you can see from this map, we connected the website to Google Analytics from its beginning in 2008. So we've been tracking statistics of people accessing it. About a little over 500,000 people access the website annually. About 80% of these users are new users. We get about 3 million pages a year in some 800,000 sessions. But the vast majority of our users are based here in the United States. You don't have there, but we can track that. And we can see that most users are probably teachers and students because the accessibility fluctuates according to the academic or school year in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's mostly teachers and students using. The remote origins of the website date from the publication of Philip Curtin's The Atlantic Slave Trade, a census in 1969. Dr. Curtin was trying to address or answer some fundamentally quantitative questions about the history of the transatlantic slave trade in particular. He wanted to know the overall size of the traffic, its evolution over time, and geographic distribution. So he relied mainly on secondary sources, that is, work by authors studying slave trade who, by that time, were using primary sources or archival sources. But he did also start a database of slaving voyages, about a little over 2,000 records of voyages, which he recorded the information on IBM, Fortran, punch cards, like those you see there on the picture. That's the foundational basis of the slave voyages database. And many researchers, my predecessors, have struggled with transferring data from one medium to another. So starting with punch cards, going with magnetic tapes, hard drives, flop disks, zip drives, and suddenly CD-ROM, and now the internet. It's a challenge. But in his very early work, he managed to accomplish what he had proposed and create some fantastic illustration or visuals, as you can see. These are some reproductions from his own book. The work at the time had profound impact on the studies of the slave trade, African diaspora in general, also because it occurred at an important moment. It was developed in his work at the moment of the civil rights struggle here in the United States, and also during the period of independence of the several countries in Africa. And I think that's kind of auspicious to have this meeting right here, right, at the John Bryant African American Institute at the Amilcar Cabral Center. Amilcar Cabral was one of the most, if not the greatest, African revolutionary. So it is great to be here. I feel double privileged. Right, from the 1960s, the website, or the database, I should say, was adjusted, combined, added on by other scholars working independently until about the 1990s when these 4 researchers, David Altis, David Richardson, Herbert Klein, and Stephen Barrett, decided to combine them into a master database that we now call Slave Voyages database. And they launched their results in the form of a CD-ROM, the new technology of the time. And you see their picture of when the CD-ROM was launched. It cost about $199. It is expensive now. It was even more back then. So the researchers managed to address several issues, putting in this information together over time from different media into the newest technology at the time, but there was still one big problem standing, which was the question of accessibility. So after that year, other researchers joined forces to transfer the database into a newer technology, so the internet. They not only wanted to expand the database with information about the traffic from other regions of the world, time periods and on, but also make it available on the internet as a website. And I joined the group or the project around that time, 2001, and we managed to launch the slavevoyages.org website. And what you have there is an image of the homepage of the website and when it was originally created. So I think, at that time, we managed to overcome the big hurdle of accessibility because all the information was now available for free. It was in English, but then after a few years later, we managed to translate the website into Spanish and Portuguese. I don't think we were ever going to bridge the language issue unless we come up with more sophisticated technologies. Google Translate might be one idea, but who knows. But then we now are faced with a new challenge, which is sustainability, right? We've known about this challenge since the very beginning because we've been migrating the data from one medium to another, right? Aging technologies, including the internet and computer languages, they age, they require constant update. Not only that, because the website was created in a way that would facilitate contribution and interaction, it also required researchers who are familiar with the history of the slave trade, with the historiography of the slave trade, and also with the data in the database. Right? So we need people to review contributions and add them to the new database. And with that challenge, the group then decided to organize a consortium of institutions to sustain the website in the future. It's a new model. It was launched in 2021. We're still experimenting it. We are 1 year and a half into this new medium. Started off with about 6 institutions, so Harvard, Rice, Emory, the Smithsonian Institute, William Mary, and the University of California system. And this year we gained 2 additional members, Washington University in St. Louis, and our first international member, the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados, that joined the consortium to sustain the website in the future. The organization is, there are 2 bodies in the consortium. So the steering committee made by a representative of each institution, an operational committee made also by a representative from each institution, in addition to members outside, right, from outside the consortium. And those are only the 2 bodies. And of course the host, which I am in that role right now at the moment. And our main charge, right, our main mandate is to sustain the website, update its code, answer queries, review contributions to the database, right, and work with partners that are interested in adding to the database or working with our data, and yeah, collaborate. Here are some of our achievements. Well, we managed to transition the website to a new host from Emory to Rice University in a new environment. So when we talk about the internet, there are different types of internet, right? Where things are saved in different places. So from the servers, we went to virtual machines, and then now the cloud environment, right? And we experiment with Amazon and now with Oracle for research. So all of that require our attention. We updated the code base to a recent Python version, expanded the institutional and research membership, organized 2 international conferences, in partnership with art exhibitions. Those images are posters of our conferences. We assembled the project archives at Fondren Library at Rice University, so researchers who were involved with the project, they could deposit their papers, physical collections from the library. And we launched a rotational postdoctoral fellowship because, again, this is a multi-generational project, and a lot of the researchers, the original guys, right, working on it, they retired, right? So we need to train new generation of researchers. That's serious, or the project is not going to make it, right? And we secured grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. So it's exciting. We have had several impacts. So this is some of our scholarly impact. We produce books, atlases. If you Google slavevoiders.org in Google Books or in Google Scholar, this is the result that you get. We have impacts also in the artistic field and museum studies. So these are pictures of 2 exhibitions that made actual use of the database to create this art installation and art objects. Museums all over the world use our data, including the Smithsonian, in Europe and Africa, everywhere. It's a big responsibility. And we also have impacts at the community level, and I'd like to highlight here the Middle Passage ceremonies and Port Markers Project. They use our data to identify ports involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and they work with communities of these locations to build markers like you see in the picture. And they also organize ceremonies to bring some kind of closure for the communities that descend from enslaved Africans and live in these locations. And we also have impacts at the educational level. So students all over the US and other places around the world use our data to develop their own research, to graduate, right, and also to contribute to the database. The picture there at the far right-hand side of the image shows a map of students discussing the data that they collected and they contributed to the website. And it refers to the US coastwise traffic to the coast of Texas. So that's brand new data coming up to the website, hopefully by December, and will illuminate another chapter of the African and African American saga in this corner of the globe. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. And I think you can see now why I said you must visit this resource. It's so rich and so deep, and there's so many ways to enter the resource, to interact with it, and to understand the story that it's telling. Our final panelist for the archives is Dr. Monica Muñez-Martinez, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. Her first book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, received 6 book awards. Her digital projects include Refusing to Forget, about anti-Mexican violence along the Texas-Mexico border, Mapping Violence, and Race Laws in the U.S. Southwest. The work that this professor is doing is leading the way in so many fronts in the work that CRRJ is engaged in, and I'm so pleased that she is here with us. Again, read the full bio.
Thank you all. Good morning. I'm still recovering my voice, so thanks for your patience as I squeak through this. I'm just absolutely honored to be here and to be celebrating the CRRJ's achievement, to be celebrating George Burnham's book, which I still need mine to be signed, and to be thinking about the work that is ahead. This is a milestone, landmark accomplishment, but there's so much more work to be done. And so I'll be sharing my presentation about some of the work that I'm doing in Texas. Let me see if I can. Wait, all right. Oh, there we go, thank you. That's you. That's me. Like that? Yep. Oh, terrific. Okay, so I'm visiting you all from Texas. My first book is a history of anti-Mexican violence, which is a history of racial violence and racial terror that has deep roots in our nation, but has largely been forgotten in U.S. history. It's true that nearly 250 lynchings took place in Texas alone of ethnic Mexicans, and so that includes Mexican Americans with American citizenship and Mexican nationals in Texas. My book studied the decade between 1910 and 1920, a period known by local residents as La Matanza, the massacre. Historians have estimated that anywhere from 500 to thousands of victims of racist violence died during this decade. And so some of the ongoing recovery work that we're doing is to collect the names of those individuals. Similarly to the cases that are documented in the CRRJ project, the victims that I wrote about in my book were systematically denied due process. They were criminalized through racial stereotypes, being described as bandits, being described as a foreign threat, murderers, and thieves. And the widespread racist rhetoric that was circulated by the press, by politicians, and by local leaders was so pervasive that too often these murders were not perceived as murders, but they were perceived as law enforcement or local vigilantes securing the state for Anglo residents. So just to quickly, for those of you who are unfamiliar with this history, what the findings have revealed is that citizenship, American citizenship, gender, class, age, and status social status did not protect ethnic Mexicans from violence during this period. And so some of the cases I write about in the book include a young girl who's 9 years old named Concepcion, who was actually a Mexican national whose family lived in Mexico, but she attended school in South Texas, became ill, and her mother and Thea came to retrieve her so that she could recover at home. And a U.S. border guard suspected them of smuggling, and so shot at the family, killing Concepcion. The aggressors, the people who perpetrated this violence, included vigilantes, local law enforcement, Texas Rangers, the famed, iconic Texas Rangers, state police, and U.S. soldiers. And again, as I said, these aggressors acted with impunity. And actually, state officials went so far as to promise, governors promised to pardon any Texas Rangers or local officials if they were prosecuted in clearing up the mess in South Texas. So some of the challenges that I found in recovering this history and recovering more cases, of course, is that we are dealing with a corrupt archive. The state archives, the library records, they are preserved by people who were committing these acts of violence or who endorsed violence. And the victims who we are trying to humanize in this work, in these records, are criminalized. Right? They're described as bandits, as Mexican horse thief. They're very often remain anonymous, but certainly dehumanized. And this is thanks to, people like Congressman Hudspeth here, who testified openly when there was a hearing on the kinds of abuses and said things. He not only endorsed mob violence, but also said things like, you've got to kill those Mexicans when you see them, or they will kill you. So how can we recover histories of anti-Mexican violence and tell a story about the injustices that took place? And I really found in my own work that it's impossible to do this work without community memory and private archives. And so as the lawyers in the room found clients, I found descendants to conduct oral histories with and to gain their trust and to learn from their private memories, but also their private collections. I found that families and neighbors had preserved memories of events and the lives of victims, that they had passed these memories on from generation to generation. Selectively, there was also widespread patterns of silence, of people preserving those memories for just to survive daily life. But in conducting these oral histories, I also was introduced to documents, to legal archives, to claims that were filed by widows in seeking justice, the writings of journalists that condemned the violence, but also of photographs. And so in all of the work, some of the most important findings in family homes were the photographs of people. This is a photograph of Juan Bonilla Flores and his brother Narciso. They witnessed the Porvenir massacre in 1918. It was a massacre that took place in West Texas, a small ranching community, and it was called for and enacted by the Texas Rangers in 1918. And so these were two boys who grew up with the traumas that they had witnessed. And their daughter, Benita Alvarado, was one of the descendants of the Porvenir massacre that helped to call for public acknowledgement of this history. So some of the lessons from community archives that I think are important for all of us to consider is that we have to recover the humanity of the victims, the survivors, and the witnesses. We also have to be so careful how we write about violence, because it matters. I think when people consider the audiences, we often think about, scholars that are going to do good work with our findings. But it's always important for me to consider a descendant who might stumble across the collection, and to think about how ethically we develop these narratives, so that level of respect for the victims and for the families is evident in the way that we describe these findings. It also should inform the kinds of records that we make public, especially those records that if we recognize that they are corrupt, or that if they include false, fabricated information, that we have to train the public, we have to help them learn how to read these critically. And if we don't do that, then we have to think seriously about whether or not we make those newspaper articles that smear the names or criminalize the victims, if we should make those public. And so just quickly, I wanted to say that Norma Longoria Rodriguez is one of the descendants who I've had the privilege of working with. This is a photograph from her family archive of Epigmenia Bazan and some of her granddaughters. Epigmenia Bazan and her husband and son-in-law were both murdered in 1915 by Texas Rangers. And when I asked Norma Longoria Rodriguez why she had spent so many years of her life documenting the event, trying to record it and trying to make it public, she said, quote, "It's an injustice, it never leaves you, it's inherited loss." And so this was a lasting conversation that I continued with Norma Longoria Rodriguez over the years, and inspired me to work with colleagues to develop a nonprofit called Refusing to Forget. And so this is a project that brings together historians who have recovered these histories of racist violence, and actually do the work of trying to commemorate them publicly. So many of the families that I interviewed had been trying for decades, for example, to get a state historical marker. They had been trying for decades to get access to archival materials in libraries and been turned away. And so by leveraging our authority and our access and using our elbows, we had the privilege of working with the State History Museum, the Bullock Museum in Austin, Texas. And so you can see the portrait of Juan Bonilla Flores and his brother Narciso is on display. The museum staff was shocked. They shouldn't have been, but they were shocked when they scoured the Library of Congress, when they scoured Texas archives, regional archives, and they could not find a picture of a victim or a descendant or a witness. And so by working with people like Norma Longoria Rodriguez and Benita Alvarado, we were able to introduce these community members and say, these are their faces. these are their families. And so this is, Norma Longoria Rodriguez is sitting here in this photograph in the center of the photograph on the left with her cousins. They participated in a family panel at a conference for the unveiling of a state historical marker for the Bazan and Longoria double murders. And so, you know, the public programming around these historical markers, as has been described by our contributor in the panel in the Smithsonian, that, you know, it's not just enough to have the marker, but to have the public dialogues, the public expressions, and spaces for these families. It's also true, it's a difficult truth, that racial terror took many forms, and that the full extent of this violence is still unknown. And so that has really shaped the work that I've done on mapping violence, to continue to document cases of racist violence in Texas, and to study how these histories of violence intersect. And so Texas is a state that was founded and established on a history of colonization, slavery, and conquest. And so the histories of racial violence against different racial and ethnic groups are pervasive in Texas. And so the collecting that we do for mapping violence collects cases of racially motivated acts of violence targeting African Americans, ethnic Mexicans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and European immigrant minorities. And we also document multiple forms of violence. And something that we are adding to the collection is recording lives impacted. So not just the victims, but the survivors, the names of surviving relatives, witnesses that testified in court, for example, and aggressors as well. And so this is some of a research forum, for example, that students contributed to in a mapping violence research seminar last year. And so, you know, they're organizing metadata around locations, you know, where an event might be mapped, metadata related to people, so a victim, they write short biographies, but also this includes a short biography of an officer who investigated the crime. You know, they collect their lists of sources, but something that's quite important for us is not just, you know, remembering that we are researching people, not just events, and that we are focused on documenting lives, not just metadata. And so one of the important practices that we introduce to the students that work on the team is that they go through the process of trying to write these event narratives, both the abstracts but also longer narratives. And many of the students have actually described, followed practices of writing obituaries, that when they write the sort of summaries that they want people to take away the lives that were impacted by the loss of this person. And so I'm just going to wrap up really quickly to say that as Judge Burnham has outlined so eloquently in her book, you know, violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that actually violence buttresses or supports race laws and Jim Crow laws. In Texas, there is no list of Jim Crow laws or Juan Crow laws targeting Mexican nationals, and so I've been working on a project to document race laws in Texas from 1836 to the present, so that we can study the relationship between peaks of violence, the use of violence to enforce laws, but also when legislation is inspired by upticks in violence. And so we are collecting Jim Crow laws and city ordinances, Juan Crow laws and city ordinances, black codes, slave codes, and laws targeting indigenous populations, immigrant populations, as well as migrants. So I'm going to, I think that's where I'm going to stop. That's where I'll stop. But all of this to say is that there's so much more recovery work to do. And, you know, I'm sort of the small potato on the panel because in seeing slave voyages, right, you can see the widespreading impact. And so the sort of mantra that I have is if you build the archive, you know, you can imagine what can be done with it. And with digital tools, you know, we have the ability to make these projects more accessible. But with that, we have to think about what are the ethics and politics so that when we put them out into the world, they're generating constructive conversations, that they can promote some form of closure or healing, or animate people to participate in change. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, so, good. Each of these panelists talking so
knowledgeably and thoroughly about the thought that goes into their work, how they approach it, how they engage in it with other people in the communities, where their work touches. And one of the things, I'm going to start with a question, first the observation that for the work of the Center for Restorative History and the work that Dr. Martinez is doing, you both emphasize the relationship with the communities and how important that is. And growing up as a person who loved museums, like that was the highlight of my family vacation, was going to a museum, Archivist. And that was not what I saw in the museums. And I think that this restorative history, changing their relationship with museums, what museums see themselves as, and what academic research into with communities can be, is the thing that I think that stands out for me in both of the work that each of you are doing. And not just for a museum, the museum saying, okay, now we're going to collect these things so you can come and look at them. But what the museum seeing itself as a partner in the community, so that the community sees the museum as a resource and not just a place to come and look at things on the wall or exhibition. And for you, Dr. Martinez, seeing the work as, I know what I'm going to find in these official archives, and I know it's not going to be something that I necessarily want to publicize, that there's something else there. But I'm not going to take it just for me. It's not just for me, it's for this community. And so I wonder if each of you could say a few words about that in your work.
Sure. Well, there's so much to unpack there. But I'll just start by saying that, I started my career at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, had the privilege of building a collection from scratch there and working with folks around the country to really tell the untold story of the history of slavery in particular was my area of focus. And that required a lot of trust building, doing work all around the country and really the globe to build trust with folks to be able to appropriately steward their stories at an institution like the Smithsonian, which represents the museum field, which is inherently colonial, right? With regard to work in communities, I just want to frame especially, what happened for museums post-2020, which was that everyone made a pivot and turn towards social justice. And, transitioning to the National Museum of American History and thinking about the legacies of harm that that museum in particular holds within its collection, you have to think about what's the most honest way to start that work. And you can't just say, tomorrow we are now a museum focused on social justice. What restorative justice really offers us is, it really tells us that justice work can't start until there's a full accounting of harms, right? And that work has to begin in local communities. And it fundamentally alters the way that we go about our practice. For instance, with the till marker, typically what that would look like is maybe a curator picks up the phone, has the object shipped, maybe they make a one-day visit, talk to probably just the head of the museum or the physical site that holds the object, and then interprets. Instead, we made 2 separate week-long trips traveling throughout the state of Mississippi into Alabama, meeting with keepers of this history, family members of Till, local community archives, HBCUs, really keepers of this history, and asked, what would it mean to remove this object and bring it to a national site? In many ways, for museums, the exhibition, the actual act of collecting and ownership is is the ultimate product. And for restorative history, it is really the community building and the repair that's happening with the communities, dictating to us what our institutional obligations are to them as an institution and also a field that has perpetuated in their harm. And with regard to that, again, as the Till sign I think really demonstrates how it fundamentally alters, how we think about mutual capacity building, which frankly can be a fluffy term that usually is one directional in terms of how people think about it, which is the institution building the community, when in fact it could not be more the opposite. What we saw on the ground that scholars like Dave Tell are just unearthing now is this deep local knowledge that has always been bubbling to the surface of Till's local Mississippi story, which changes how we understand that history, and when so much focus has really been on his mother's decision and what happened in Chicago with the funeral. To me, that's really emblematic of the work of CRRJ, and what this archive is doing is really shifting the focus also when people popularly think about the civil rights movement from the 50s and 60s to really the forebears, and thinking about that trajectory going back to the 30s and 40s, and really showing that longstanding history of resistance, the informal modalities of resistance, the people who, as Toni Morrison eloquently talks about, the silences in the archive, who have historically been anonymous, whether that's women agitating, or actually even just thinking about repairing the actual historical record of people who never were granted due process. We see ourselves as learning from the work of CRRJ, and also as being in solidarity with that work as well.
Thank you.
I'll just say really quickly that the work of recovering cases of racial terror is slow, and so the students that work on the project in a year with a team of research students were able to maybe research 25 cases. We have a full set of students, closer to 30 or 40, and so the recovery work is slow, especially when you are doing the depth of research to research the lives of the victims and the descendants, and the perpetrators, and putting them in conversation, and tracking their movements around the state. But just to talk about the sort of impact, and again to the dean's point about the histories and legacies of racism, the work of that recovery is so slow. In contrast, in building this short record of race laws in Texas, that same research team was able to recover and document 350 cases, 350 race laws in just 4 months. And that's because, the records of the state and the constitutions have been digitized, the several constitutions in the state of Texas have been digitized and transcribed, and they're OCR readable, and, the state statutes are available online. And so that recovery work is just so much more fast. And I was like, man, this is what it feels like to be a historian that can just walk into the archive and everything's there for you. The work that we're doing is we're building the archives. And so that is like a slow and steady pace. But to the point about how do you use even those corrupt archives, the 2016 museum at the Bullock Texas State History Museum was all along the way we thought we were going to be canceled. Thankfully, when it came to fruition, the centerpiece, what allowed the staff to have the Texas State Preservation Board green-lighted, was that the heart of the exhibit was this 1919 congressional investigation into Texas abuses by Texas Rangers that was led by the sole Mexican-American state representative. And although that is a record of the quotes like people like Claude Hudspeth, there were also testimonies, people testifying about the kinds of abuses. But that state record existing, that congressional hearing being on the record, those 3 volumes being on display, was what made the project legible, the exhibit on anti-Mexican violence legible to the State Preservation Board, of being worthy of being in the State Museum. But I'll also say, in terms of trust building with communities, that the community, the opening receptions for that exhibit, had wait lists. They actually had to have additional days of programming because so many people wanted to come and see. But from the people who I spoke with and the descendants who attended that museum exhibit, they were not coming to see and to learn a history that they didn't know. They were coming to see the State History Museum finally acknowledge the history. And that's where the trust building happens. It's not just, we are going to give you this object, and now we're going to see what you do with it. And then there's trust. It's taking it all the way through. And I feel like that's the empowering work of public history museum work and digital humanities for being able to make these projects accessible, but also for the public to assess the work and participate in the critique.
Thank you. I'm going to apologize to the audience. We don't have time for your questions, but I am going to ask Dr. Domingues one question, which is, I was struck by the images you showed of the overtime changes to slave voyages, and not just the preservation challenges, but the continuing relevancy to researchers who might say, oh, you've done that, that's over, and the way the project continues to find ways to be relevant to communities.
So the preservation is, and it's going to be, a challenge, remain a challenge. Just because the technologies change and we are constantly receiving contributions. I like to describe the database as an organic database because it's always changing, new information, new voyages, sometimes corrections to the information that we have. So that's continuous work and require us to work with new generations of researchers, computer scientists, programmers, because again, also computer codes, they change over time, right? So it's, I guess we just have to develop an attitude, right, of being or feeling comfortable with the fact that these things are always going to be changing, right? And working with community, we do some work with community. I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of our energy is focused on reviewing contributions and adding information to the database because public want to be seen in the database, right? They want their regions, their stories, right, covered in the database. A couple of things that we did at the beginning that I thought was very helpful was when we launched the website in 2008, just before we launched, we invited teachers from Atlanta region, because that's where the team was based at the time, to come and develop lesson plans, right? So we have a few lesson plans on our website that teachers all over the country can use, and they are made for different student populations. So that had an immediate impact with the broader public, especially with students. But we also work with community organizations and giving tutorials, answer queries, organize their exhibitions. Right, we provide that a lot too. We meet a lot with, for example, genealogical societies, African American genealogical societies. There's a chapter in Houston, for example. I attend their events, answer questions, right, give presentations if they ask me to. So there's that level. And then there's organizations like the Middle Passage markers, right, the port markers I showed you earlier, that they make direct use of our database and to conduct their own activities. And sometimes they do ask for advice, and we provide.